The early days of 3D horror video games were characterized by a few notable titles that established the genre's key tropes and conventions. One of the earliest and most influential of these games was Alone in the Dark, which was released in 1992 and set the standard for survival horror games with its emphasis on exploration, puzzles and limited resources. Other early horror games included Sweet Home, released in 1989, which was the inspiration for the first Resident Evil game, also with Doom, released in 1993, and System Shock in 1994, which combined horror elements with sci-fi themes and introduced players to a concept of real tension and fear to expose players to a more involved and emotion-filled experience. Early 3D horror games typically used pre-rendered backgrounds and fixed camera angles to create a sense of tension and claustrophobia, and often featured slow-paced gameplay with deliberate pacing to heighten the horror experience. While these early horror games were limited by the technology of the time, they laid the groundwork for the genre's evolution and eventual explosion in popularity, with games like Resident Evil and Silent Hill in the late 90s and early 2000s. But very few know that there is a lesser known game that was developed alongside Alone in the Dark that would also help to pave the way for these future classics to exist, that would be released under the name of Dr. Hauzer. Dr. Hauzer is a 1994 survival horror adventure video game developed by River Hill Soft for the Panasonic 3DO interactive multiplayer console. River Hill Soft is a Japanese company known for its work in creating many murder mystery adventure games. The development team was small and only a few members are credited with being responsible for the game's computer graphics and polygon design respectively. The video game market was transitioning from 2D to 3D graphics, particularly in the United States, with an intense focus on research and experimentation with 3D technology on higher-end personal computers, and believed that the release of the Panasonic 3DO would be inspirational in marking the beginning of the 3D gaming era. Dr. Hauzer was developed for the platform, becoming the first fully 3D survival horror video game. The game sees players taking control of a newspaper reporter, Adam Adler, investigating a large isolated mansion, looking for clues to the whereabouts of the missing archaeologist, Dr. Hauzer. The player must navigate the mansion by collecting items, solving puzzles and avoiding traps, while being able to switch between third person, first person and top-down perspectives to complete required tasks and objectives. This feature was a first in this genre and carried over to River Hill Soft's next game, Overblood, which would be released on the Sony PlayStation console in 1997. Dr. Hauzer was only released in Japan and has received decent reviews for its time, being praised for its sound design and 3D graphics, but was criticised for its short length and slow frame rates. The game has never been officially released outside of Japan, but fan translations do exist today. The environments and elements in the game are fully rendered in 3D, and the default viewpoint is a third-person perspective, using fixed camera angles that adjust according to the player's position. Rooms are separated by doors, staircases or other pathways that act as loading screens between them. These loading sequences would later be used in the iconic Resident Evil games and would become a benchmark in the series until the transition to more action-focused gameplay with Resident Evil 4 in 2005. As with many of these earlier horror games, Dr. Hauzer would also make use of the often hated tank controls, where pushing up or down on the controller's directional pad moves the character forward or backwards relative to the direction they are facing, and pushing left or right rotates the character, which at the time would be very confusing for players to understand, hence why players hate them so much. Additional inputs allow the player to run, jump, interact with the environment, pick up and use items and access an inventory. The inventory includes a notebook for saving progress, a map, keys and puzzle solving items. Some items can be combined. The game itself features no combat or enemies, instead it includes traps and obstacles that can cause instant death to the player. These include floor pits, rooms with swinging blades, and hallways with rolling boulders, among many others. The player can switch between first person and top-down perspectives at any time, and these views can provide different advantages for investigation and navigation. In Dr. Hauzer, the game's backstory is presented through the protagonist, Adam Adler. Set in 1952, Adler is a young reporter for the Boston Science Monitor newspaper who has built his career around covering stories about Dr. Hauzer, a famous archaeologist who suddenly vanishes. Adler tracks Hauzer's last known location to a secluded mansion, where he finds journal entries and learns that the house is filled with traps and secrets. He discovers that Hauzer and his assistants uncovered a stone lithograph with ties to an ancient spirit, and that Hauzer became obsessed with deciphering its meaning to communicate with the spirit and gain immortality, leading to his descent into madness and the sacrifice of his assistants. Adler makes his way through the mansion and has a brief encounter with Dr. Hauzer's ghost before arriving through a minecart ride to the location of the artifact. There, Hauzer's spirit, now a giant face, is intent on killing Adler, but the photo of Hauzer's wife causes an explosion and Adler narrowly escapes the mansion as it collapses. In the epilogue, Adler expresses that he doesn't want to publish his findings because they will be dismissed as fiction. Only he will know the truth behind the events of what happened to Dr. Hauzer. Alone in the Dark, which was released in 1992, was a pioneer in the survival horror genre and inspired many future horror games, including Dr. Hauzer. Both games share similar visual cues, gameplay mechanics, and a focus on puzzle solving and exploration. One of the key elements that Dr. Hauzer borrowed from Alone in the Dark utilised pre-rendered backgrounds with fixed camera perspectives that would later become the standard with the early Resident Evil games seen on the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn consoles. This technique was essential in creating the game's claustrophobic and unsettling atmosphere. By using pre-rendered backgrounds, the game's developers were able to create highly detailed environments that were rich in atmosphere and could be explored from multiple angles. By restricting the player's view of the environment, the games were able to create a sense of tension and unease. The player never knew what was lurking around the next corner or behind the next door, which added to the game's horror elements. In addition to borrowing gameplay elements from Alone in the Dark, Dr. Hauzer also took inspiration from the game's storyline. Both games involve a mysterious mansion full of secrets and a dark history, and players must explore the environment to uncover the truth. Overall, Dr. Hauzer owes a great deal to Alone in the Dark in terms of its gameplay mechanics, storytelling and atmosphere. By using pre-rendered backgrounds and fixed camera angles, both games were able to create a sense of immersion and horror that would become the core foundation of many future 3D horror games. While the game has many similarities to Alone in the Dark, it focuses more on adventure and exploration throughout the texture-mapped polygonal environments that can be witnessed through multiple camera perspectives. Upon its release in Japan, Dr. Hauzer received generally positive reviews from the staff of Weekly Famitsu and other media outlets. It was compared to the successful Alone in the Dark series, with some reviewers noting similarities but praising its 3D graphics, multiple camera perspectives and puzzle solving gameplay. The game's aesthetics and 3D models were stated as revolutionary for a home console at the time, and its soundtrack and sound design were also praised. However, some reviewers found that the game's puzzles less rewarding or complex than those seen in other similar games, and the instant death associated with some traps was also criticised. Despite its positive reception, the game was never officially localized outside of Japan, and as such, it remains exclusive to the region. River Hillsoft's next game after Dr. Hauzer was Overblood, a horror game for the PlayStation, which also featured fully 3D graphics and multiple camera perspectives similar to Dr. Hauzer. Some sources have noted that the game's use of flat, shaded polygons was also an early example of cel shading, a technique that would become more prominent in later years. Dr. Hauzer is often viewed as a significant step in the evolution of the survival horror genre, influencing the development of games such as Resident Evil and Silent Hill. The game's impact is often attributed to its use of 3D graphics, exploration-based gameplay and survival elements, which lay the foundation for future games in the genre. Despite not being officially released outside of Japan, fan translations do currently exist. Dr. Hauzer has played a significant role in the development of horror games that have helped to inspire many of the greatest games in the survival horror genre. Yet, despite its relative obscurity, it introduced several innovative horror elements that would influence future games within the genre. One of the most notable elements of Dr. Hauzer was its use of sound design. The game relied heavily on audio cues to create a sense of unease and tension. The sound was designed to be disorientating, with distorted noises and echoes that added to the game's eerie atmosphere. Another key element was the game's use of environmental storytelling. The mansion in which the game takes place is full of strange and unsettling details that hint at a dark history. As the players explore the environment, they uncover clues and piece together the mansion's past, which adds to the game's sense of mystery and dread. While the game made use of pre-rendered backgrounds and fixed camera angles, which would become common in early horror games, it took things a step further by introducing a fully 3D character model that could be rotated in real time. This added a level of immersion to the game that was not present in earlier horror games, and paved the way for future games to experiment with camera angles and player perspectives. Overall, Dr. Hauzer may not have been a commercial success, but its innovative use of sound design, environmental storytelling and 3D character models helped to shape the future of horror video games. It demonstrated that horror games could be more than just jump scares and gore, and laid the foundations for the genre's continued evolution. While we have looked at the many traits, features and unique elements that Dr. Hauzer used to innovate the future of the horror genre, there are many other games that utilise similar ideas that also help to shape the way of how future games would be developed, which you can learn more about by watching this next video that looks into the many ideas of how games utilised these concepts to provide even more intense and scarier experiences.